He arrived certain that it would be just a dinner, flowers in hand, hope in his pocket, and the future he imagined within reach of his fingers. But it took just one whispered sentence in the hallway to unravel everything he believed he knew about the woman he loved. In that impeccably neat house where every gesture seemed rehearsed, he would discover that some families do not show their scars. They hide them behind porcelain, silences, and practiced smiles. And that loving someone means sometimes facing the shadow they themselves still fear to acknowledge. Hello, my friends. I am Linda, and this is Linda Love Stories. I hope you enjoy this story. Matthew adjusted his navy blue tie as he parked his car in front of the Morrison family house. The dashboard clock read 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled dinner time. Punctuality was something his mother had taught him since he was a child, even when it meant taking 2 buses to avoid being late for school. He took a deep breath, holding the bouquet of lilies he had bought for Lisa's mother. In the pocket of his jacket, a small velvet box weighed more than it should. He didn't plan on proposing that night, but he liked knowing it was there, as a promise for the near future. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in his city, the son of a nurse who worked double shifts after his father died. Now at 35, Matthew Thompson was a respected neurologist at the Central Hospital, an achievement that still seemed surreal when he remembered the night studying under the dim light of a second-hand lamp. The Morrisons' mansion contrasted with everything he knew. A 3-story Victorian building, ornate windows, and a garden that looked like it had come out of a magazine. Lisa had never mentioned that her parents lived with such comfort. Lisa was everything he could wish for. A dedicated paediatrician, with a smile that lit up any room and a natural kindness that charmed him from their first meeting at the hospital cafeteria. After 8 months together, meeting her parents seemed like the natural step. When he rang the doorbell, he heard the sound echo inside the house. Moments later, the door opened, revealing not Lisa, but a woman in a formal maid's uniform, around 60 years old. "Dr. Thompson, I presume," she said with a polite smile, but something in her eyes seemed to change when she saw him. Recognition, perhaps. "Please come in. The family is in the living room." As he followed her down the hallway lined with artwork and family photographs framed in silver, Matthew felt an inexplicable chill. The house was immaculate, not a single object out of place, almost like a museum where people shouldn't really live. Lisa appeared at the living room door, radiant in a light blue dress that matched the house's decor perfectly. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, a restrained gesture that was unlike the warm hugs she usually gave. "Matthew, these are my parents, Eleanor and Richard Morrison." Richard Morrison was a man of upright stature, with grey hair carefully combed back, and a handshake that was too firm. Eleanor had the same classic beauty as Lisa, but with something dimmed in her eyes, like a light that had been gradually diminished over the years. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Doctor," Richard said, indicating a leather sofa. "Lisa tells us wonderful things about your work." The conversation flowed superficially during the aperitif, questions about his medical specialty, comments about the hospital, polite compliments about his career. But there was something in the interactions that made Matthew uncomfortable. The way Lisa checked her father's reaction before speaking, how Eleanor seemed to calculate every word, how Richard subtly dominated every subject. "Dinner will be served in 10 minutes, announced the housekeeper entering the room. It was then that Matthew realized why he felt that initial strangeness. Looking more closely at the woman, he recognized features that time had not completely erased. "Ruth?" he asked, surprised. "Ruth Alvarez?" The woman stopped, her eyes widening slightly. "Yes, sir. Do we know each other?" "I'm Matthew Thompson. You lived in the building next to mine when I was a child." A spark of recognition lit up the woman's face. "Matty? Evelyn Thompson's son?" Lisa looked confused. "You two know each other?" Before Matthew could respond, Richard interrupted with a cough. "What a fascinating coincidence. Ruth has been working with us for over 20 years. Eleanor spent the day overseeing the menu especially for tonight. Ruth nodded and withdrew silently, but not without casting a significant look at Matthew. During dinner, Matthew observed the family dynamic with new eyes. He noticed how Richard subtly corrected Lisa's posture when she hunched over her plate, how Eleanor barely touched the food but constantly served her husband, how the laughter was controlled, never truly spontaneous. "Lisa mentioned where you grew up," Richard remarked, pouring himself more wine. "A rather challenging area for a child." "Actually, I have great memories from there," Matthew replied. "We had little, but we never lacked the essentials." "The essentials," Richard repeated with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fascinating how people redefine that word according to their circumstances. Eleanor lightly touched her husband's arm. "Richard, please. I'm just observing, dear. After all, we should know the man who is courting our daughter." Lisa lowered her eyes to the plate. Matthew noticed her hands trembling slightly. When Ruth came in to serve dessert, Matthew excused himself to go to the bathroom. In the hallway, she was waiting for him. "Matty," she whispered, looking both ways, "you shouldn't marry someone from this family." The words hit Matthew like a punch. "How do you—" "The way you look at her. The little box in your pocket that you keep checking. I know that look." Ruth took a deep breath. "This family is not what it seems." "What do you mean?" Ruth hesitated, years of silence weighing on her expression. "I've worked here for 2 decades. I've seen things." She looked again at the dining room. "I can't explain now. Meet me in the garden after everyone is asleep, near the fountain." When Matthew returned to the table, he couldn't get Ruth's words out of his head. He watched Lisa more closely. Her tense smile, the way she checked her father's reaction before answering any questions, how she seemed to calculate every gesture. After dinner, Richard suggested they have digestives in the study. As they walked down the hallway, Matthew noticed a photograph he hadn't seen before. Lisa, perhaps 12 years old, with a piano trophy. Her smile seemed forced, her eyes sad. "Lisa was an extraordinary pianist," Eleanor commented, noticing his interest. "She practiced 5 hours a day." 5 hours? That seems a lot for a child, observed Matthew. Richard chuckled lightly. "Excellence requires sacrifices, Doctor. Something we've tried to teach Lisa from an early age." In the office, while Richard showed off his collection of Cuban cigars, Matthew noticed how Eleanor sat perfectly upright on the edge of the armchair, as if she couldn't fully relax even in her own home. At 11 p.m, Lisa accompanied him to the door. Alone for a moment on the porch, she seemed to relax for the first time that night. "Sorry if my father was a bit intense," she said, nervously adjusting a strand of hair. "He just wants the best for me." Matthew held her hands. They were cold despite the warm summer night. "It's okay. They seem interesting." Lisa smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "They liked you. My father wouldn't have shown the cigar collection if they hadn't." After saying goodbye with a restrained kiss, Matthew pretended to leave but parked the car a few blocks ahead and returned on foot. He waited in the shadows of the garden, near the fountain Ruth had mentioned. Shortly after midnight she appeared, still wearing her uniform but with a coat on top. "You came," she whispered, sitting on the stone bench. "Ruth, why did you say that? What do you know about this family?" Ruth took a deep breath, looking at the illuminated house. "Do you remember when you used to come to my apartment after school? While your mother worked the night shift?" Matthew nodded. Ruth had been a constant presence in his childhood, the neighbour who always had a snack waiting, who helped with homework, who dried his tears on bad days. "You were a good boy, Matty. Kind, like your mother." She paused. "This house is not a place for kind people." Gradually, Ruth unfolded a decades-long story, how Richard controlled every aspect of family life, what they ate, wore, whom they talked to. How Eleanor had been a vibrant woman who gradually lost her voice. How Lisa had grown up in an environment where perfection was the only acceptable option. "Have you ever noticed the scars on Lisa's wrists?" Matthew froze. He had noticed, of course. Lisa always wore bracelets or watches to cover them. When he asked, she vaguely mentioned a difficult period during adolescence. "It was after the state recital. She was 16 and missed a note. One note, Matty. Richard didn't speak to her for 2 whole weeks. Not a good morning, not even a glance." Ruth wiped away a tear. "I found her in the bathtub." Matthew felt his stomach turn. "And why do you stay here? Why didn't you report it?" "Report what? Richard never raised a hand to anyone. He doesn't need to." Ruth looked at the mansion. "I stayed for Lisa. Someone needed to be here, you understand? Someone who saw her as a person, not as a reflection of his expectations." Matthew then understood many aspects of Lisa that previously seemed like peculiarities. Her almost obsessive need to check if she had done something wrong. The silent panic when she made small mistakes. How she seemed genuinely surprised when he expressed pride in her achievements. "What can I do?" Ruth gently touched his arm. "Lisa loves you. I see how she talks about you, how she relaxes when you call. But," she hesitated, "loving someone from this family means loving their wounds too, wounds that may never fully heal." The next day, Matthew invited Lisa for a walk in the park. Sitting on a bench by the lakeside, away from the oppressive walls of the Morrison mansion, he held her hands. "I want to tell you about my childhood," he began. "About growing up without a father, about how Ruth helped us when Mum was working." Lisa listened, surprised by the coincidences, by the connection that existed even before they met. Then gently Matthew asked, "And you? How was it growing up in that house?" The silence lasted so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. But then, like a dam finally giving way, the words began to flow. Years of impossible demands, nights crying silently to avoid disturbing anyone, the constant feeling of never being enough. "I thought that if I became a doctor, I would finally earn his approval," she confessed. "But then it was the wrong hospital, or the wrong specialty, or—" Matthew held her hand tighter. "Lisa, you are enough, exactly as you are." Silent tears streamed down her face. "I'm so afraid of being like them, of not knowing how to love without controlling." "That's why you go to therapy on Wednesdays," concluded Matthew, finally understanding why she was so reserved about that weekly commitment. In the following weeks, Lisa began to set boundaries with her parents. Small at first, like not answering all of Richard's calls or declining dinner invitations when she was tired. Eleanor, surprisingly, was the first to notice the change. On a Sunday afternoon, while Richard was at a golf tournament, Eleanor showed up at Lisa's apartment. "Your mum is here," Lisa whispered on the phone, panicking. Matthew arrived in 20 minutes expecting to find a tense scene. Instead, he found the 2 women in the kitchen, Eleanor crying quietly while Lisa held her hand. "I'm ready to leave," Eleanor said when Matthew entered. It took a long time. 3 months later, Eleanor was living in her own apartment for the first time in 30 years. Richard, confronted with the reality that he could no longer control his wife and daughter, oscillated between anger, manipulation, and rarely, moments of genuine reflection. On the night he finally proposed, Matthew took Lisa back to her hometown neighborhood, to the small park where she used to play. Ruth was waiting, with a small cake she had made especially for the occasion. "When you warned me not to marry someone from this family," Matthew said, holding Ruth and Lisa's hands, "you were right, because I'm not marrying the family. I'm marrying Lisa, the incredible person she is despite the family." 2 years after the wedding, while they were organizing the room for the baby on the way, Lisa found an old photo album that Ruth had secretly compiled over the years. Pictures of her genuinely smiling, stolen moments of true joy amidst the performative moments for the official Morrison albums. "She always saw the real you," Matthew said, hugging her from behind. Lisa held the most recent photo, herself, Matthew and Ruth at the baby shower, all smiling with no forced poses or restrained smiles. "This is how I want our daughter to grow up," she said, stroking her belly, knowing she is loved exactly as she is, that she doesn't need to be perfect. Richard eventually sought therapy, though more due to external pressure than internal conviction. The changes were slow. Decades-old habits did not disappear overnight. But there was progress, small moments when he could let his guard down, see the damage he had caused. On a quiet afternoon, while Lisa was nursing little Evelyn, named after Matthew's mother, she reflected on how a simple phrase whispered by Ruth had changed the course of so many lives. "Sometimes," she said to Ruth, who was quietly knitting in a nearby armchair, "we need someone who sees beyond the facade, someone to tell us the truth we are afraid to face." Ruth smiled, observing the little family she had helped form, or someone to remind us that we can write our own destiny, regardless of where we come from. Matthew, entering the room with a tray of tea, added, "Love does not heal all wounds, but it gives us strength to carry what cannot be healed." They knew that the road ahead would not be perfect, that Lisa would still have bad days, that the patterns learned in childhood would not completely disappear. But they had created a space where imperfection was not failure, where vulnerability was strength, not weakness, and this, in the end, was the greatest act of rebellion against everything the Morrison family had represented. The courage to be authentically imperfect, and to love oneself nonetheless. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.